is a snippet of a bigger story. If you remember the the Torah for the Jewish faith is the first five books of the Bible. And the first book deals with creation and then moves us from the early understanding of God's relationship with God's creation and God's people. And then we get into the story of Moses. And so Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy all have to deal with Moses and the people and God's relationship with them and setting the ground rules and setting the parameters and in the relationship of what a covenant is between God and God's people. And so anyway, Matt will be preaching this Sunday on the 8th chapter, the 1st through 10th verses, and I'm going to veer off a little bit from that, pick up a little bit of an overlap, but his sermon will help remind us of some of those things too. But this is Deuteronomy is really a discourse that Moses has with the people. If you remember, this is the time in which Moses beginning the transition for the Israelite people from his leadership to the new leadership and what is going to happen as they move into the promised land. So this passage today really is a recap for Moses. Moses is talking here to the Israelites and beginning to tell them about a reminder of who God has been, what God has brought them through, who they are to be, and what they are to do to go forward. And if you remember with this, one of the things I love when I take folks to the Holy Land is to be able to be on the Jordanian side of the valley there and to stand on Mount Nebo as Moses has and to look over into the promised land, and down to the left is the Dead Sea. And if you know where to look across the valley there, the Jordan Valley, you can, if you know where to look, you can get a little bit of a glimpse of the backside of the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. And then you look up to the north and you begin to see what would be the Galilee. And of course, you can't see that far. And a lot of times it's hazy, but it's really a dramatic experience. To be standing up there. And one of the things I always remind people is that Moses got to look into the promised land and we were able to go. And it's so much the same way as with the Israelites with that. So the first four chapters of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses recounts the history that is there. This is a recounting of all that Yahweh has done, all that God has done with them. Chapter 5, he recites again the 10 Commandments, which he has received on another mount, Mount Sinai, over in Egypt, where God has given them again the laws, the rules for how they are to live. Chapter 6 recounts the great commandment, which we call the Shema. With that, or the Israelites call the Shema. It is, hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God. God is one. And you are to love God with your heart, your soul, and your might, or your strength, as we often say. And that is, again, the scripture passage that they have on the doorpost and they touch as they go out and as they come in with that. And so we get to chapter 8 at this point. And this is... begins the commandments and to remember in what they are to do to keep the commandments that God has given to them and to remember their history. What Moses doesn't want them to do, what God doesn't want them to do, that Moses is speaking is you've been through all of this, a time of captivity, a time of being released from that captivity, a time of moving toward the promised land. It's been 40 years that we have been through this journey. And what we don't want to forget as you move into this promised land is all that God has done and God will continue to do. And when you move into this new land of milk and honey, don't forget Don't forget what you've been through. Don't forget God in the midst of that. So he first of all begins in chapter 7. And if you can go ahead and put that up, Mark 7 through 10. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with flowing streams, with springs and underground waters welling up in valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat bread without scarcity, where you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and from those hills, whose hills you may mine copper. You shall eat your fill and bless the Lord your God for the good land that he has given you. What a contrast to what they have experienced over the last 40 years. And that's what Moses is saying to them. You can't even imagine this land that you're going to, and just remember that God is the one that has provided all that for you. So Moses is preparing the Israelites for the day when they will enter into the promised land. They'll need to remember that they're not entering the land on their own. It is a gift that God has given to them. And obviously water is what is beginning. He begins by talking about all this water. They have been in a journey which water has been scarce, to the point that even Moses was allowed by God to use his staff to strike the rock into which water would come from, because there was no other source, and the people were thirsty, and they had never experienced a thirst like this before. And so for that reason, water, of course, is essential, an element that they can't live without. Without water, there is not life. And so with that, not only comes for them to drink, but also that they're able to experience that in the fertile land which they will find with that. And so the land is also a land of wheat and barley, a land of vines and figs and pomegranates, and we have the oil from the olive trees and the honey that we'll experience. And these plants are what give a broad, they have again almost been at times only eating manna. And so they're going to have a smorgasbord of opportunities. And one of the things that I often find too in the Galilee and the fertile part of that country is that you go to a smorgasbord, you go to a buffet, and you think you've seen everything, and all of a sudden there's something that you didn't see the day before, and fresh fruit and all those kinds of things that are there. So this is a land that's going to provide them with wheat and barley for bread. They're going to have vines for the wine that they will need to drink. There are fig trees and pomegranates, and that is the fruit that they will have. They'll have oil from the olive trees, and which is essential, obviously, for their cooking and for lamps and things like that. And then the honey that they'll have for sweetness. Now, a lot of times the honey is not necessarily honey from beehives as much as it is from the sweetness that they will get from dates and other things. They have also grapes that they boil and create a sweet nectar that comes out of that. So all that is done. So this is, interestingly, that there's not milk in this, but the milk also comes from the ability to have areas of the land where they can have their cattle, and they can be able to have enough that the cattle can eat, and they can also have milk from that. It's also bread is not only the staple of life, but it's also the reminder that bread was the essence of what they were. And for that reason, they're going to lack for nothing, being in this new land that they're going to, that God is providing for them. The other part of this is the minerals that they will be able to have. And so they'll be able to have the minerals that will give them what they need for the iron and the copper. That creates not only wealth that they can use for trading, but also they're going to be able to build and to have what they need using that. And mostly is for defensive reasons. But there's all kinds of things, as you know, that iron and copper are used for with that. So the mineral rights that they'll have from this place is also wonderful. And then Moses instructs them that when they eat their fill, they're not to forget. You shall eat your fill, and then don't forget to thank God for where this has come from. It would be real easy to gorge yourself with food that they haven't had, and then kind of think of it as just something that would be you take for granted, because this is obviously something they haven't had. And because of the focus on the Thanksgiving that is here, this passage is often used in Thanksgiving services, just as a reminder that all that we have has come from God, and that we are to be thankful for that. So if we'll move on to the next part of the passage here, we come to 11 through 17. Take care that you do not forget the Lord your God, by failing to keep his commandments, his ordinances, his statutes, which I am commanding you today, when you have eaten your fill and have built fine homes and live in them, and when your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and your gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, do not exalt yourself, forgetting that the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness, an arid wasteland with poisonous snakes and scorpions, he made water flow for you from flint rock, and fed you in the wilderness with manna that your ancestors did not know, to humble you and test you, and in the end to do you good. Do not say to yourself, my power and the might of my own hand has gotten me this wealth. So be careful that you don't forget that, remembering the covenant that Yahweh has always kept with the Hebrew people, remembering the mighty acts that Yahweh is the pathway to wisdom of life. You've learned from your experiences. Forgetting Yahweh is a pathway of foolishness and also death. Remembrance has provided the Israelites with the tools, and God has given them the tools they have to remember. They are to remember, one, the Sabbath, if you remember that, to keep the ground holy, foretelling that all that God has provided. So take time each week as a part of your regular routine to remember God. They are also forgo the eating of leavened bread during Passover, that they might remember again the law that Yahweh has given them. They are to wear fringe on their garments, and some of you who have seen the prayer shawls see the streams at the end of that remind them as they pray. They handle those, they touch those to remind them of who God is, and that they are to remember the commandments that God has given them with that. They are to teach. They're to remember by teaching the children. One of the verses in Numbers that we talk about is teach your children, talking to them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down and when you rise up. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house. That Shema. So always have the word of God close to you. When you wear your prayer shawl, remember God. When you go in and out, remember God. You shall write it down and have it on the doorpost, and you shall have it on your gates, and so that you remember that all that God has given to you and all it does. So remembering then involves more than just remembering by your mind. It's also remembering requires action on your part. That you remember not just by remembering and recounting, but you remember by acting out as God has called you to act, to live a life that God has called you to live. And so you say, it's kind of the same thing that we are called to do. Put your faith into action is what we're told. Put your faith in a way that God knows you are thankful, in a way that God knows that you are God's presence in the lives of others with that. And then the wilderness taught them a lot. They learned a lot in the wilderness, and I had a preacher one time that was talking about the wilderness became those memory points for the Israelites that just continued to remind them that they were dependent on God, that God provided all they needed, and that even in the midst of this very desolate and sparse land, the wilderness of their lives and the wilderness of their experience, that God provided all that they needed with that. They were on the move so much when they were in the Exodus, when they were moving toward that. And a lot of that had to do, again, there's traditions is that there was, 500,000 people or more that were moving together as a group. And so there was only so much that was there available. They were nomadic because they had to keep moving to be able to have new resources to them. So in the midst of that, Israel is needing to learn how to be prosperous. And that's what Moses is providing for them. It's not since that they have been in the time of Joseph when they were in captivity that they had all that they needed. And so they've had this period of time when they went from having prosperity to then having nothing and being totally reliant on God. And so they're continuing to do that. For many centuries, they have gone through this, and now they're there with that. But this is a time for change. They're going to be going from having nothing to having a lot. For the first time as a nation, Israel is now going to experience real prosperity. And it tells us in the scriptures that they're going to have fine houses. They're going to have generous herds and flocks. They're going to be having silver and gold in abundance. And this sounds like an absolute wonderful future. It sounds like their own easy street with that. And we all know what happens with that. We see all the stories in the news all the time about being a lottery winner. And they win millions and millions of dollars, only for many of them to end up with nothing. They don't know how to manage it. They don't know how to do it. And so they think because of that, that they're able to handle it. And what happens is they buy things that they don't need to exorbitance. And for that reason, they give money away. They have friends that come to them and try to barter with them about all the things that they need. And so for that reason, they lose it all. And that's what Moses is trying to remind them. God is trying to remind them through Moses at this point that just because you're going to have all this stuff doesn't mean you need to squander it. You need to still be faithful. You need to still be good stewards of that. And so that way, you don't want to forget all that God has taught you in the midst of that, and become prey to all the kinds of devices that are out there that would take us away from what God wants us to do. They just don't need to forget. And I think that's the driving point of this section is do not forget and be thankful. They were tempted for centuries in slavery. They were tempted to forget that they were trapped between Pharaoh and the Red Sea. They were tempted to not forget that Yahweh stretched out his hand and saved them continuously, God that provided all they needed. So don't forget with that. And if they do, they'll fall like giants. And it's a reminder of the story of David and Goliath, how they were so small, yet Goliath was so big. And you can let that become overwhelming to you to the point that you fall. You think you're big. You think you're giant when you have all this prosperity. And we can see what happens when that comes to a terrible fiery end for them. So they are to make sure that they have storehouses. They had manna in the wilderness that God provided for them, but they need to have storehouses for the overflowing wheat and barley that they will have. They will be tempted not to forget any of that. The other part of this is they don't need to forget that they need to be humble. That because God has provided all of this, that they need to know they were tested as a part of this. God humbled them through the wilderness experience. And so it's time for them to be on their own, and that God has taught them not so much to punish them and make things harsh, but to make sure that they knew how to live, and to set ground rules. And we do that for our children a lot, is we set the ground rules of how our family lives and how we're supposed to do, and that we're not supposed to squander the things that we do. So in a lot of ways, the testing that God did for the Israelites was quality control, so to speak. It was an opportunity that God could be sure that they would be faithful people and that they could learn to live. So then we move to the next verse there, 18 through 20, which is the end. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, so that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your ancestors, as he is doing today. If you do forget, and this is where God says, don't forget, but if you do, here are the consequences. If you do forget the Lord your God and follow other gods to serve and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord has destroyed before you, you should perish, because you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God. God is trying to remind us that we're not self-made. God gives us the ability in this life to move ourselves from where we have been to where we want to be. But it is also a reminder that God has been in the midst of that. That God is the one that has done that to us. And also, kind of don't read your own press. If things start going well and you live in this world of prosperity, don't begin to read what other people are saying about how wonderful you are. Some of you that will remember Mac Davis's song, which I still had in my head as I was thinking about, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way." It's one of those things. It's hard for us to be humble when we think we're so wonderful and others are telling us we're wonderful. And so God has given us the talents that we need, and they are a gift from God. And we should not take those talents for granted with that. And then ultimately, in this final thing, God has renewed the promise. Once again, the continued promise. God began with Abraham with a covenant and a promise. And throughout history and time, God has continued to remind us of that renewal of that promise that God has with us. And so that we would be faithful people, and that we must be faithful both this day and forevermore. And so we give God thanks this day for all that God provides for us, for the thanksgiving we have, for the accountability that God gives to us, the parameters that God has given us to live in, and the opportunity that we have to be faithful followers. And with that we not forget. Because if we do, it often ends, when we go our way, it often ends up that we mess it up. And so let's be faithful to God. Let's move forward as God has called us to be in every way that we can. So anyway, Mark, if you'll divide us into groups and put the questions up, we can go from here.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and break us into groups here. Let's see. Let me pull this up. So it looks like we got all of us on today. We're all on Zoom, right? Is that right? No one's.
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to break us into 5 rooms here. And I will bring us all back here in about 23 minutes. You'll get the 60-second countdown. For those who have been in person for a while, may have forgotten, you'll get a 5-minute warning, and then the 60-second countdown. When that hits 0, it's going to abruptly bring you back.
And don't forget to post. Don't forget to post the questions in the chat, Mark.
Yep, you got it, man. All right. So 1 sec, let me get those out. Otherwise, you will not be able to see them. Copy that. All right, you guys should see this pop up in your chat and it should follow you to your room unless, I don't know if they fixed it. If you're on an iPad, you might not be able to see this. So let's hope that everyone has at least one person without an iPad in there. And we'll see you back here in a few.
Here he is.
Good morning. Follows you always.